Good morning. Thank you, Daniel. That's how you read a gospel story. So, this morning we turn to a rather different group of people than we're accustomed to talking about, the chief priests, and I've grouped the Pharisees in here. The title I was originally given didn't have the Pharisees in it, but actually it's important we do include both of these groups of people because they're both important. So in our previous sessions, we've considered the reaction of Thomas and also the experience of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And a couple of weeks ago, Mark Greenstock spoke about Thomas's open-minded doubt, and he encouraged us to be honest with our questions. Today, we turn our attention to this other group and their closed-minded doubt. And Mark also warned us about the dangers of fake news, and as we'll see, today's passage contains a real corker of a fake news story. So, I'm just going to adjust this slightly because it's a bit close. Hold on. That's it. Right, good. So today, we are thinking about the chief priests and also the Pharisees, who are sometimes known as the scribes or the teachers of the law. Now, we often hear about these people in the gospel stories, but do we really understand who they were? Oh yeah, this is our series. We're kind of in this middle bit now. So I don't know about you, but whenever the chief priests and the Pharisees are mentioned in the gospel stories, I have this sort of feeling that you can almost hear the crowd going, "Boo, they're behind you." But this is not; these are not pantomime baddies. I think we can sometimes portray them as such, and it's a lot more nuanced than that. And also, they're not one homogenous group of people. They were two very different sets of people. And we can't really begin to understand their response to the resurrection unless we understand a little bit more about who they were and what they believed in. So first of all, who were the chief priests? Now, in Jesus' day, the chief priests were the senior leaders of the Jerusalem temple. So there was the high priest, and then there were other top-ranking priests from the leading families who helped to run the temple and its administration. And remember, these priests were descended from the line of Levi, specifically from Aaron, the brother of Moses. And they'd been given the responsibility for serving in the temple, for guarding the temple, for teaching the people the truth. They needed to keep the people in line with God's law. And they were also the custodians of the sacrificial system, atoning for the sins of Israel. They were, in fact, the sort of mediators between God and the people. And so in Jesus' day, these priestly families were very powerful and very wealthy, and they were a sort of ruling elite, the aristocracy of the Jewish people. They had a lot of political influence, but they also had to tread a very careful line to maintain relations with the Roman occupiers of Judea. And the relationship with the Romans was quite complicated. The Romans relied on the Jewish authorities to collect taxes for them. They also needed them to maintain public order and to avoid any sorts of uprisings or revolts against Roman rule. And the Roman rulers and governors could interfere a bit, and they could appoint high priests of their own choosing, which sometimes interrupted the sort of perfect line of inheritance that had followed before. Now, the chief priests enjoyed wealth and status and a degree of their own autonomy in how they ran the religious affairs of the temple, but they were often trying to keep a very uneasy peace, trying to appease the Romans whilst trying to protect the religious life of the Jews under the occupation. Many of the chief priests belonged to the sect called the Sadducees. In contrast, the Pharisees were not priests. They came from a much broader social background. They were experts in the Jewish law, and they also developed, in addition to the written Torah, they developed an oral tradition of other regulations. And these often you hear Jesus talking about in rather a critical way often, in terms of other complications that the Pharisees added to the written law. The Pharisees and Sadducees did not always see eye to eye, and they disagreed about quite a few things. They could cooperate politically when they had a shared goal, such as maintaining public order, or preserving the temple system, or opposing any sort of perceived threats. And that's why we do sometimes see them acting together in the gospel stories. They did have real tensions, so they disagreed on quite a few theological points, specifically things like the existence of angels, the afterlife, and the concept of the resurrection. The Sadducees would only accept the authority of the Torah, and they rejected the oral traditions that the Pharisees had built up. Now, the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection of the dead, but the Pharisees did. But the Pharisees believed that this would be at the end of time, and it would be all the righteous people all at once together, and it definitely wouldn't be the resurrection of one man in the middle of history. So let's turn to our narrative today, and I want to sort of consider a few points of interest. So firstly, we're told in the story that these two groups went to Pilate on the day after the day of preparation. So that means they went to Pontius Pilate on the Sabbath. Now, this was a special Sabbath during Passover, and considering what sticklers the Pharisees were for keeping the Sabbath and observing it, this is quite remarkable. I was trying to think of a modern-day equivalent, and the closest I could think of was the Prime Minister calling a Cobra meeting on Christmas Day in the middle of Christmas lunch, but even that doesn't come anywhere near it. I mean, this was really an unusual and extraordinary thing to do. And obviously their concern is so great that they're willing to forfeit the Sabbath regulations to go and meet Pilate. So why are they also worried? Now, the Jewish leaders really wanted to put a stop to the Jesus movement once and for all, because Jesus was a significant threat. In the gospel accounts, and particularly in Matthew, Jesus is portrayed as a sort of a comprehensive destabilizing force to the authorities of the day. Firstly, he did things like he challenged the chief priests and the Pharisees' authority to interpret the law. So when he taught, he said things like, "You have heard it said, but now I say to you." So in other words, your teachers have taught you like this, but now I'm showing you a better way. He often undermined their public authority and their honor by outwitting them and out-teaching them, and he publicly criticized them as well. I mean, he called the Pharisees a brood of vipers on one occasion, and the crowd then said things like, "We've never heard teaching like this," or, "This man teaches as one with his own authority." He also disrupted the temple system with its economic and symbolic centrality. Remember that the chief priests were desperately trying to keep this kind of peace, and any sort of public disorder was a major risk and danger. Jesus threatened to destabilize this. He drew large crowds. He said provocative things. He claimed to be the Messiah. He overturned the tables of the money changers. So in summary, Jesus posed an existential threat to the power, the legitimacy of this group of people, and also to the stability of the religious order they tried to maintain. So it seems that the chief priests and Pharisees were still not really sure that the matter was over, even though Jesus was dead. Now, they'd clearly heard, or they knew about Jesus' prediction that he would rise on the third day, and they must have understood this to be a bodily resurrection, not just some sort of vague spiritual going to heaven kind of rising, because otherwise why did they feel it was necessary to physically guard the tomb? They think there's some sort of risk that the disciples will sneak up to the tomb, steal the body, and then point to the empty tomb and say that the resurrection has happened, and then this will trigger the revolt that they're fearing and the riot amongst the people, and really a reaction against those who'd crucified him. So they go to Pilate and they ask for his help. The Romans had crucified Jesus. They were the ones under whose authority it was done. So perhaps the chief priests felt they needed Roman approval to guard the tomb. Or maybe they thought that a government-sanctioned Roman guard would be the best deterrent for any sort of sneaky disciples coming along. So why does Pilate agree to their request? I mean, Pilate comes across as quite a sad character in the story. He's quite a weak character, but you've got to feel a bit sorry for him by this point. I mean, the guy has been dealing with this irritating matter for days now. Even his wife has been on at him about her dreams, and now he's completely fed up. He just wants this thing to go away. It just needs to end now. So he gives them the guard and says, "Go on, do what you need to do." Now, the great irony here is that the opponents of Jesus seem genuinely concerned that the Jesus movement is still alive, active, and dangerous. Meanwhile, his actual disciples are scattered in fear and hiding in locked rooms. His enemies seem to recall Jesus' predictions of resurrection more than his disciples do. So, to recap, what are the chief priests and Pharisees trying to prevent? They do not want there to be an empty tomb due to the disciples stealing the body and claiming Jesus had been resurrected. And when the tomb is found to be empty, what story do they end up telling? That exact same lie. So think for a moment about these guards, assuming these are highly trained Roman soldiers. What were the implications for the guards of the empty tomb? Well, this was really very risky. There was actually a danger to their lives because they'd effectively appeared to fail on their guard duties, and that could carry a death penalty. So imagine their fear and panic as they go to report the incident to the chief priests. But then in a strange turn, they end up being paid off with a handsome bribe in return for telling another potentially embarrassing and dangerous story, admitting to falling asleep on guard duty and failing in their task. Still very risky. It must have been a large sum of money that they were paid. But the chief priests also promised to protect them from Pilate should the report ever get back to him. This week I've been wondering a lot what happened to those guards. We're not told in the story at all. I mean, they witnessed the angel of the Lord coming down, moving the stone with an earthquake, and then they go through this emotional roller coaster of thinking that their lives are over, and then they're not only spared the punishment, but they receive a hefty cash bonus. Now, this is my own pure speculation, but I think this is utterly in keeping with how Jesus treated the small man. In that, you imagine Jesus in the middle of pulling off the resurrection, and then he thinks, oh, but let's just make sure they don't get into trouble for this, and actually let's make sure they get enough cash to retire to a nice village on the Dead Sea coast. I think it's just brilliant. I wonder how many of those guards eventually became Jesus' followers. Maybe one day we will find out. So back to the chief priests and Pharisees. So why does this story they invent really make no sense at all? I mean, this story they spin, the disciples stole Jesus' body whilst the guards slept, it just doesn't really hold water. I mean, consider how improbable it is that an elite guard of Roman soldiers trained for vigilance would all nod off at the same time whilst on duty, especially given the severe penalties they'd face. And even if, against all the odds, every single guard fell asleep, it's difficult to imagine none of them being woken by the sound of the heavy stone being rolled away or the commotion of the disciples trying to haul off a dead body. And most problematic of all, if they were all asleep, how could they possibly know what had happened or who was responsible? The fact remains that the tomb was undeniably empty. That's the bit that's not in dispute anywhere. Nobody seems to debate it was empty. But the story concocted to explain it just doesn't really add up. So what does all this teach us about the chief priests and the Pharisees? Well, their rejection of Jesus was not simply a matter of misunderstanding or of ignorance. Rather, it stems from several deep-rooted factors. They had prior commitments in their minds, both theological and institutional, that made it really difficult for them to accept anything that threatened their system of belief. And they seem to have had this kind of hardness of heart that stopped them being open to any other possibility, no matter how compelling the evidence might be. They did face significant social pressures. I mean, they were worried about their status, they feared losing their place in society, and they worried about the opinion of others. And ultimately, their selfish desire to preserve power and control was the driving force behind their actions. It was almost impossible for them to approach this situation with true openness or to genuinely consider the evidence that was before them. We're going to have a very quick psychology lesson because the chief priests and the Pharisees, they exhibit a typical psychological response that humans all often have when they're faced with new and unwanted information. This is known as motivated reasoning, otherwise known as goal-directed cognition. We all do this all the time. It happens when we've already decided on a conclusion and then we adjust our reasoning to try and justify it. even when the data we're confronted with doesn't really match our pre-existing belief, we find a way to sort of justify it to ourselves. There's some really famous examples of this. The biggest one probably is Galileo. So in the early 1600s, Galileo presented convincing evidence that the earth moved around the sun. But he was vehemently opposed by the Catholic Church of the day and persecuted for what he'd proposed. And the church authorities started with a firm belief that the earth could not move. They got that from scriptures, and they thought that that was so contradictory that they couldn't possibly change their minds. Here's another chap. You may not have heard of this Hungarian doctor, Dr. Semmelweis, who, when he was working in Vienna in the general hospital there, noticed that women giving birth to their babies in the doctors' wards died from fever far more often than those who gave birth in the midwives' wards. And it was such a well-known thing that there would be women who would beg not to go to the doctors' wards and would actually give birth on the street because they felt it was safer. He made several connections and eventually linked the deaths to the doctors handling dead bodies before they went to their pregnant patients. He showed that physicians could reduce maternal deaths by washing their hands. But rather than embracing this brilliant and life-saving observation, many doctors resisted, not because the data was absent, but because the conclusion implicated them in causing deaths. The goal of the chief priests was to avoid validating Jesus' claims to be the Messiah, and they wanted to maintain their authority and the stability of their rule. So when they're confronted with the evidence of the empty tomb and the testimony of the guards, they start with the fixed conclusion that Jesus could not have risen from the dead, and then they make an account to justify it. And it's interesting to note they don't even investigate the empty tomb. There's no hint that they look into it at all. They just immediately come up with a plan to explain it away. In the days after Jesus was crucified, it isn't the disciples who appear most alert to his promise to rise again. It's his enemies. And the chief priests and the Pharisees take whatever steps they need to keep a dead Messiah dead and to keep their world from being overturned. Matthew shows that they didn't just try to reinterpret what happened, they deliberately created a false explanation to cover up the truth. This wasn't just some kind of unconscious bias. This was a conscious effort to reduce their discomfort by manipulating the facts and influencing others. So were these inherently evil men? It's really hard to know what they were actually thinking. I mean, what did they really believe occurred at the tomb? Did any of them have a sneaking suspicion that Jesus actually might have risen from the dead? Or were they just so committed to their entrenched opposition to him that their minds were completely closed to this possibility? Now, we do know that there were some who had more open minds. In John chapter 12, we read that, yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved human praise more than praise that comes from God. And after the crucifixion, we see Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish ruling council, asking Pilate for the body of Jesus. And he was assisted by Nicodemus, who was also a member of the Sanhedrin. And both of these men were drawn to Jesus, but they followed him secretly for fear of the Jewish authorities. But before we shake our heads at the chief priests and the Pharisees, we should ask ourselves some questions. When God challenges what we've built our lives on, will we practice humble, open-minded doubt that's willing to be led by the truth? Or will we do some sort of motivated reasoning to try and explain away what threatens us? Because Jesus cannot just be a nice add-on to our existing systems of belief and our hierarchy of priorities. He threatens to disrupt and reorder everything. For some people, it is just too much of a threat to long-held systems of belief, identity, or security. And even when faced with the evidence for the resurrection, it's too much cognitive dissonance to handle. And those who have the most security, possessions, power, or status can find it the hardest to surrender to Jesus. The rich young ruler found this out when he met Jesus himself. I think there is a bit of chief priest hiding in all of us. And if we think there isn't, it's probably in our blind spot. Because we justify ourselves all the time. We hold on to possessions or habits or behaviours or ways of thinking that we find just too difficult to let go of. But Jesus wants to lift our eyes to a much greater prize that we could ever hope to gain in this world. He says that I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. But we have to be prepared to be considered foolish in the eyes of the world. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." Many will stumble over the cross of Christ, thinking it utter foolishness and irrelevance. Some will take pride in their own wisdom, understanding, or academic ability, and fail to grasp their need for Jesus. Still others will be so caught up in the superficial diversions of this life to give any time to consider the matter at all. Others will, like the chief priests, have minds that are closed because the personal stakes seem too high to allow the truth in. But if by the grace of God we are given eyes to see and hearts that are willing to be humbled and minds that are open to the truth, the resurrected Jesus will make himself known to us, and he will give us life, and life in all its fullness. Amen.